Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Williams, and today I'm going to show you how to build a 1-to-1 gear ratio in Onshape. Okay, so here is the link to the doc that I got from my assignment, and it's view only, so I need to make a copy. So I'm going to go up to the three dots in the top right corner, and then I'm going to tap copy to make a copy of this assignment that is editable. Now I'm going to title this one with my name, and then tap copy workspace. So I know this is my document and it is editable. Sometimes this takes a moment to copy, so just be patient. Okay, so I want to begin by going on a little tour of the files found at the bottom of our workspace. I'm actually going to tap this main folder icon at the left to show you these are our home folders. Now, I have already imported parts for you that we will use in an assembly. There's a structure folder, and in that structure folder there is a 2x12 beam. This is what we're going to build on. I'm going to go back to this main home folder icon. There's a motion folder, and in that motion folder we have a rubber shaft collar. There is a spur gear with 36 teeth, a spur gear with 60 teeth, a spur gear with 12 teeth, and then a pitch shaft, which I will also call an axle in this video. If I go back to the home folder, you will see that there's also an electronics folder, and I've imported what we call a smart motor. Now this smart motor, if you look on the back side, has rooms for pins, but we're going to just constrain these holes right here. We're going to constrain these holes to the holes on the beam. Now you'll see that this square hole looks a little different. This is actually where you insert the pitch shaft or the axle, which is also square. So the square metal pitch shaft gets inserted right in that hole, and when this motor spins in a circle, either clockwise or counterclockwise, it's going to spin the axle. So we'll talk more about that when we attach the motor. I'm going to go back to my home folder. You'll also see that there are Cad Imports. These are all of the parts together. You actually don't even need any of these folders because we're going to insert the parts straight from the Insert menu into the assembly file. Now this document did not come with an assembly file, so we need to start by adding an assembly file. So I'm going to go to my little arrow down at the bottom, and then I'm going to tap this plus sign, and then I'm going to tap Create Assembly. And you'll see that it names it already Assembly 1, and you can see it is now listed in the bottom of our files, and this is where we will begin to build. Okay, so I'm going to begin by inserting the structure part, the 2x12 beam. So I'm going to go to the Insert menu with that little arrow in the top left corner. I'm going to insert the 2x12 beam, and I'm going to hit check mark to accept. Now, the one thing about the iPad is every time you insert a part, it appears right on that center dot. And we are now in the isometric view. If we look at this little view cube and you tap it, you can tap isometric, and that's how you know this is the isometric view. It has the top at the top, the front on the left side right there, and then the right on the right. So I want this beam not only to move off of this dot, but I want to turn it so that it's in the isometric view. So I'm going to tap the beam to select it. I'm going to move it off of the dot, and then I need those arrows to appear again. So let me double tap my white space to deselect my part. I'm going to select it again so the arrows appear, tap on the beam. Now I have these little arrows and I can move it. So I'm going to twist this with this arrow. I'm going to twist this so the top of the beam matches the top of your view cube. So the reason we're doing this is we want every time we come back to the isometric, we want this beam to be in this position. So we need to do what's called fix the beam. So I'm going to double tap my white space to deselect the beam. So I'm going to go over to this left menu, and I'm going to what's called fix this part. So I'm going to use the three dots, and I'm going to tap on fix. And this will add a little icon, this little lock icon, that means that this part is fixed in this position, which means that whenever we move this around like this, if I go back to that isometric view using the view cube menu, it's going to home it back in this position. So we want the beam fixed, not only with the top of the beam matching the top of the view cube, but off of that center dot. So when we bring in new parts, it doesn't come right on top of our beam. All right, we're ready for our next part. We're going to insert the pitch shaft or the axle. So I'm going to go ahead and tap the Insert menu. I'm going to go down to the 4x pitch shaft, tap on that, and see how it comes right in on that dot. That's why we moved the beam. And then I'm going to check mark to accept. Okay, now with this, I'm actually going to insert this axle or pitch shaft into the fourth hole. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 holes from the left side. And I'm going to use the Revolute Mate. I'm going to double tap to deselect that. I'm going to use the Revolute Mate because we want this axle to spin. Okay, so I'm going to go up to my constraints icon in the top left corner, the fourth one over. I'm going to tap on that to open my constraints menu. And then I'm going to tap on the Revolute Mate because we're going to make this axle spin inside of that fourth hole. So I'm actually going to turn this a little bit so I can see the top of this axle or pitch shaft. I'm going to use my selection tool. So I'm going to hold my finger down on the screen and then come on over to the top of this axle. And that looks like it's the center point right there. I'm going to zoom in to just make sure I can do this correctly. Here's my selection tool, holding my finger down on the screen, coming over, and I want that center point right there. I don't want the corner. I don't want the line on the edge. I want the center of the top right there. So if it doesn't select it, it looks like it does. It says one entity selected. If it doesn't, just tap it again. Okay, now once we select one, you are not able to move your parts on an iPad, but the view cube still works. So I'm going to go to the isometric view, and so I can count over 1, 2, 3. I'm going to zoom in. 1, 2, 3. I'm going to use my selection tool. I want this fourth hole right here. And see how there's 3 little dots in there? That's the top, that's the middle, and then kind of hard to see there. But I'm going to use the top center right there. It doesn't look like it selected it, so I'm going to tap the center dot, and that selects it. All right, it looks pretty good. I'm going to check mark to accept, and we can take a better look. Let me go to my isometric view. So it looks really good. It looks like it's centered in the hole, but we need this axle to be pushed through to the right, so a little bit overhangs to go inside the motor. So I actually need to do what's called offset this axle and push it through. So I'm going to go over to my menu on the left, and you can see the Revolute Mate that we just made has 3 little dots. I'm going to tap on those, and I'm going to open the properties window by tapping Edit. And you can see that there's a little offset button. I'm going to turn the offset on, and then I'm going to offset the distance about, let me just see what 1 inch does. And that's definitely too far, so let me change that to 0.5 and see what that looks like. And that looks pretty good, 0.5. So let me check mark to accept. So this little overhang on the right will be inserted into that square hole in the motor. All right, let me go back to my isometric view so I can home it and center. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add the motor. So the motor is going to create this axle. It's going to make this axle spin. So that will be where we put our driver gear. All right, so I'm going to go to the insert menu, and I'm going to look for the smart motor. I'm going to tap on that. Notice it's going to come in when I hit, oh, let's see, did it come in? I hit the second one down and it worked. Notice it comes right in on that dot. That's why we moved that beam out of the way. And then check mark to accept. Now, I actually want the motor on the other side of the beam, so I'm just going to kind of move it over there because you can see we need these dots on the back side of the motor to be attached to these holes on this back side of the beam. So I'm going to move the motor over just to kind of see where it would go to help place it. I'll move it to that side of the beam, but I also need to, let me get the arrows back there by selecting. I also need to flip it over. Oh, can I get the arrows back? There we go. I need to flip it over like this. And I actually think I want to flip it over one more time. Not that way. I'm spinning it around. Let's see, is that the way? Yeah, like this. Okay, you don't have to do this. It just helps you to kind of see it visually. It's going to go on about right here on the back side. So I am going to use, let me double tap to deselect my motor. I'm going to use the hole that's in the center right to the left of the axle hole. Okay, so that hole right there, we're going to constrain, let me go to the back side, we're going to constrain it to this hole right here. Okay, so the third hole in, so it's right, it's going to be closer to the end, right below the axle. So let me double tap to deselect. Okay, so we're going to use the Fastener Mate for this. So I'm going to go to my Fastener Mate menu, or my constraint menu. I'm going to tap the Fastener Mate. I'm going to use my selection tool by holding my finger down and coming over to this third hole right there, that center right there. Now I can't move it with my fingers, but I can use my view cube to go back to the, let's see if the isometric works. Let me try the front view. That's better right there. So I want the hole, this hole right there. Let me zoom in to make sure I'm getting it right. I want this one right there. Doesn't look right to me. Let me zoom in a little more. Looks a little tricky. It looks like it's going inside the motor. I don't want that. Ooh, I almost got one that would work. There we go, that one. You see how the whole circle is highlighted with that center point? That is the one I want, right there. And if it doesn't select it by itself, just tap that white dot. And it kind of disappeared, but I just need to go back to the isometric view. I'm going to check mark to accept and go to my view cube and go isometric so it homes it. And that looks really good. I think it's probably a little bit overlapping right there. The motor's overlapping and kind of merging into the beam. So I'm actually going to offset it and pull it out a tiny bit. Okay, so let me open up that Fastener Mate we just did by tapping the 3 dots in my left side menu for that fastened mate. I'm going to edit it and I'm going to tap that offset button so it opens up the offsets. And if I look, I think it's the Z axis that axle's on. So I want to move it the Z distance. I just want to move it. Let's see what 0.1 does. Oh, it went the wrong way. So I'm actually going to add a negative sign to my 0.01. Can I do it? I'm going to just delete that. Negative 0.1. That's actually a little bit too far. I'm going to be very picky and I'm going to do negative 0.05. Now, you probably could have left it alone. It's fine, but I like it to be just perfect. So you can see that now I'm going to check mark to accept. You can see that motor is exactly flush onto that beam, and that axle is going into that spinning hole that's going to spin. Now, normally you would probably do a fastener mate on that hole, but that gets a little complicated. So that's why we fasten these holes to the holes on the motor. Okay, we're ready to add our gear. So we're going to go back to the insert menu and we are going to insert the 36 tooth spur gear. I'm going to tap on that to bring it into the workspace, check mark to select. All right, so I'm going to use the Fastener Mate because we actually don't want this gear to spin on the axle. We want the gear to be fastened to the axle, so when the axle spins, the gear spins with it. So here we go. We're going to use the Fastener Mate. I'm going to go to my constraints icon. I'm going to use the Fastener Mate. And again, we're going to use the center point of this axle right there. Looks pretty good for my first entity selected. And I think I'm going to need to move this a little bit. Let me see with the front view cube with that. I need to see the center. Nope, that doesn't work. Let's do the bottom. That works. Okay, so I need to get the center of this hole right there. I'm going to zoom in to make sure I get the right one. Use my selection tool. There we go. You see that the whole circle in the middle of the gear is highlighted, so that looks great. It didn't select it, so I'm going to tap that dot. Did it get it? I think it got it. Let me see. Check mark to accept. Let me go back to the isometric view. That is not correct. No big deal. I'm going to delete that Fastener Mate by tapping the 3 red dots and delete. And I'm going to move this gear. I want to move this gear so it's a little bit easier to do. So I'm going to move it out here. Let me double tap to deselect and then select it again. I want to flip that gear so it's easier to mate before I tap the Fastener Mate. I want them to be facing the same way. All right, double tap to deselect. This should help us out. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my constraints menu. I'm going to do the Fastener Mate, and this time, let's zoom in. I'm going to use my selection tool to pick the center point of that axle, and then I'm going to use my selection tool to pick the center point of that gear. Oh, looks like those are the sides. I might have to move this around. Oh, that might work right there. You see that hole in the middle? Let's see if that works. That works. It went on perfectly. All right, check mark to accept. Now this looks good, although that gear needs to be moved towards the beam so that it doesn't slide around. So I'm going to reopen that Fastener Mate, click Edit, and I'm going to offset it. So let's see what, we're going to go on the Z axis. So let's see what 1 inch does. That looks pretty good. Let's take a look. Check mark to accept so I can spin it around. I want it to go a little bit further in. Let me reopen that Fastener Mate and click Edit. And I'm going to try, let's try 1.1. It just needs to go a little bit. Oh, let's try 1.2. I think that's actually a little too close. You don't want it too close because it will have friction. I'm going to do 1.15. That's perfect. I know I'm very picky on my numbers. Your numbers can be a little bit different. That's fine. I just am trying to get it as real to life as possible. Check mark to select. Let me go back to my isometric view. And so what you'll notice is you want a tiny little gap so that there's no friction and this gear spins and it's not rubbing on the beam, but you also don't want it to move around. So we're going to add a rubber shaft collar to hold this gear in place. So I'm going to go back to my insert menu. And now I'm going to tap the rubber shaft collar, and it doesn't look like I placed it. Let me try the one with the part numbers. Did it place it? Oh, it's placing it off my screen. That's why I can't see it. Okay, perfect. Check mark to accept. All right. Did it put 2 in there? It did. I placed it twice. No big deal. I'll just leave it there for my next one. Or you can delete one. Let me go ahead and delete it for you. So delete the second shaft collar. Okay, so just place 1. They do come in right on top of each other, so you might find that you've inserted more than one like I did. Okay, so we're now going to, I'm going to move this shaft collar. On the iPad, it's easier to kind of move, let me double tap to deselect. It's easier to move it where you kind of think it's going to go, so it's easier to use the Fastener Mate. So I'm going to actually move this one, let's see, I kind of want it to be, can I pull it up a little bit? No. A little tricky. These arrows are a little tricky. Can I get it like this? That doesn't really help. Well, let's just see what we can do. Okay, so I'm going to do the Fastener Mate. Go to my Fastener menu. I'm going to tap on the Fastener Mate, and I'm going to select the end of this axle. You might need to zoom in to make sure you're getting that center point right there. All right, it says 1 entity selected. Perfect. All right, I think I might need to move my view cube. Let me try what the bottom looks like. That'll work. So I need to see that center hole. Let me try and get it. I think I need to zoom in. You definitely want the whole circle to be highlighted and not just an arch like that or a point like an arch like that. You don't want that one. You want this circle in the center highlighted, something like that. All right, it seems to have already moved. Let me check mark to accept. Go to my view cube, hit isometric, and see what it did. All right, looks pretty good. So it looks like it's where it's supposed to go. It's centered, but we definitely need to offset. So I'm going to reopen that Fastener Mate, and I'm going to edit. And I'm going to go along the, I'm going to offset it along the Z axis. Let's see what 1 inch does. That looks pretty good. I think it needs a little more. Let me try 1.1. And that check mark looks perfect. All right, so that rubber shaft collar holds the gear in place so it doesn't move along the axis. All right, let me go back to my isometric view to home and center the assembly. Okay, looking good. We are now ready to add our second gear on. So I'm going to go back to the insert menu, and I'm going to insert a pitch shaft 4X into the workspace. And let's go ahead and check mark to accept. Okay, so this time we're going to move down 2 holes. I'm actually going to insert the 36 tooth gear at the same time. I could have just done it on my last insert. Notice how they come in right on top of each other. It looks like they're constrained, but they're not. All right, so I'm going to check mark to accept. I'm going to move the gear. You'll see they're not constrained right now when I move it. I can simply move it right here. And I can move that pitch shaft too, or that axle. Oh, it's kind of, I got to double tap to deselect. They grouped them together. Okay. So if I use this gear, I can kind of measure. I can flip it up, and I can kind of measure it, move it towards the assembly to see what hole we're going to use. All right, that looks pretty good. Let me double tap to deselect. It's a little bit overlapping. Let's see if I can get it to come out a little bit. I think it's going to be here. This is a better view. I'm going to tap it to select it, And you'll see when I mesh those teeth, there we go. You can see that where the holes align. I'm going to put that axle in that second hole from the last gear we just put on. Okay, so that was just to measure. I'm going to move this off. Let me go back to my isometric view. So now I'm going to use the, deselect my gear. I'm going to rotate this around, and I'm going to use the Revolute Mate because I'm using an axle and I want it to spin. So I'm going to go to my constraints menu, tap the Revolute Mate, use my selection tool by holding my finger down on the screen and selecting the top of that axle. Again, zooming in will help. Make sure you get the right one right there. Perfect. Looks like it selected it. All right, so I might be able to get the second hole from here. Let me go back to the isometric view so I can select this hole right there. Let me zoom in. For my second entity selected, I want the top of that hole. Now notice you could pick the middle or the bottom right there, but I'm going to do the top of this hole. It just depends on where it's going to glue the axle or Revolute Mate the axle. All right, that looks good. I'm just going to go ahead and offset right now because I know I need to. I'm going to tap that offset in the properties window and I'm going to offset it. I think we did it 0.5 on the last one and check mark to accept, and that's perfect. We got a little bit overhang to put a shaft collar on to hold it in place. Okay, let me go to the isometric view to center. And now I want to add my gear to the axle, and we're going to use a Fastener Mate to do this. So I'm going to go to my constraints menu and go to Fastener Mate, and I'm going to first select the end of this axle. Much easier to zoom in. Okay, looks good right there. And then I'm going to go to the gear, and I'm going to select the center hole. For some reason let me go to the front if that helps. Yeah, when it's sideways, it's hard to get the center of that gear. So now that it's that front view of that gear, I'm going to get that center hole. I want that whole thing, that whole center to be highlighted right. That looks pretty good. I like it when that yellow circle appears. So there we go. You see that, how the yellow circle appears? Perfect. Now I didn't select it. I'm going to tap that white dot in the middle to select it. Check mark to accept. Looks like it disappeared, but if I go to my isometric view, the gear's on the axle. Okay, I definitely need to offset it. So let's reopen that Fastener Mate. Tap on the three dots, edit to open the properties window, and tap the offset button. And let's move it down. Oh gosh, I forgot what we did. Let's try 1 inch, see what it does. Okay, and I can turn it a little bit. Oh, not on the iPad. Check mark to accept. It looks good. It needs to move a little bit more so the teeth mesh together. Let's reopen that and edit. And I'm going to do, let's try, I think it was 1.1. Now that looks great. 1.1, and the teeth are perfectly meshed. Check mark to accept. When I go back, it looks good. I do actually want to move. I'm going to select that gear. I'm going to move it a little tiny bit. Can I do it? So that the teeth are lined up in a meshing position. Okay, double tap to deselect. Okay. Double tap, double tap to deselect. Okay, so I'm trying to get those teeth to move so they actually mesh the right way. Let me try one more time. Select the gear. I'm going to use these little arrows. Will it work? That's not the right arrow. Let's see, I did it. So I moved it. So I don't exactly know how, but I used the arrows, and you see how the teeth are now lined up with one another? That's what we want it to look like, so the teeth mesh. All right, I'm going to go ahead and double tap to deselect, and that looks really good. We just have 2 more things to add in, and that would be 2 more shaft collars. Let me isometric view to home and center our assembly. So we're going to add a shaft collar to the back side of the axle and the front side of the axle so that it stays in place. All right, so I'm going to go to the insert, and this time I'm going to insert 2 rubber shaft collars. I'm going to do one right there. I think it's just off my screen. There it is, right there. I'm going to do a second one, but it looks like it came in right on top of it. So let me move it, the first one. There we go, there's 2. All right, check mark to select or to approve. Okay, so now we're going to use the Fastener Mate, and we're going to fasten this first shaft collar. Let's go ahead and rotate it a little bit. This first shaft collar, we'll do the center of that. Let me zoom in, much easier to see. I like it when that whole yellow circle is highlighted. That looks pretty good. and one entity selected. Let's go back to the isometric view so I can see the axle. Actually, I think I want the front view. Okay, use my selection tool. Let me zoom in, make it easier. Selection tool, and I want the center of that axle. I think that's it. Let's try it and check mark to select, to approve. Okay, it looks good. Let me go back to the isometric view. I think we need to offset that. Let's open our Fastener Mate we just made, edit it, and I'm going to offset it. I think we did 1.1 inches. Oh, on the Z, 1.1. Oh, it's going the wrong way. So I need to put a negative sign in front of that. Now your numbers might be a little different, or you may need a negative sign or you don't. It just kind of depends on which selection point you use when you're fastening with your mates. Okay, that was too far. So let's try a negative 0.8. All right, what does that look like? I'm going to check mark to accept. It looks good. I could probably go in a little bit more. Let me reopen it, edit it, and I'm going to do negative 0.9. Oh, that's not right. Oh, I did it wrong. Let's go ahead and do that again. I want negative 0.9. There we go. Check mark to accept. All right, that looks good. One more thing we need to add is a shaft color to the back here. So let's go ahead and use the Fastener Mate. And I'm going to select the axle. Let me use the center of that axle right there. Looks like it selected it. Let me go back to, can I zoom out a little bit? I think I'm going to need to flip it to the back. No, isometric. That might work. Let me zoom in. I want the center of this for my second entity. That top hole works fine right there. Check mark to accept. It looks like it already moved. Let's go back to our isometric view to see what we got. All right, looks good. I could probably push it in a little bit so it holds it in place. Let me open that fastener window and edit. And I'm going to move it on the offset on the Z, just 0.1, I think. That looks perfect. Check mark to accept. And now that gear is held in place by those rubber shaft colors. Now let me go ahead and go to isometric view. Now on an iPad, it's very hard to animate the gears, but if I select one, I can rotate it like this. And notice when I rotate that gear, because it's on the Revolute Mate, on that axle, the other gear doesn't spin. So in order to allow this to spin both gears, we need to tell Onshape that there's a gear ratio here. And the gear ratio is 1:1 because the gears are the same size. Now this driver gear that's attached to the motor needs to be tied to the driven gear using what's called a gear relation tool. So let me double tap my white space to deselect that gear. So now I need to use what's called the gear relation tool. So I'm going to go back to my constraints menu, and you will see that there's a gear relation tool in the bottom left corner. So I'm going to tap on that, and it's going to ask you to select two Revolute Mates that you want to tie together with this gear relation tool. So I'm going to tap on Revolute Mate number 1 to select that. It says one entity selected. I'm going to go over to my left side menu, and I'm going to use my Revolute 2 Mate as my second entity. Okay, now if a gear goes the wrong way, you can reverse the direction down there, but I don't know that that's going to happen yet. And we want a gear ratio. See, the gear ratio is 1 in the properties window here because the gears are the same size. So I'm going to check mark to accept. Now, when I select that gear and I move it, notice what happens. Oh, let's move it. Notice what happens. I'm going to move it this way, and the other gear moves with it. Okay, so, and if I select, let me double tap to deselect. If I select the other gear and I try and move it, there we go, that's better. So I'm moving the gear. Notice that one gear spins the other gear because they now have a relationship of 1:1 and they're going the same speed. Using those arrows, I can demonstrate this. All right, that's it. You just completed your 1:1 gear ratio lesson. Congratulations on your next assembly that you've completed in Onshape.